Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, December 16th, 2024, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, this show is and will always be 100% free to download as long as I am able to keep making it. And the way that I keep going is by relying on support from individuals just like you. If you're interested in pledging your support, at least for the time being on an episodic basis, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy to learn more. This week's top patrons include Anu Bhadavaj, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Joseph Lamore, Pasquale Gelati, Rika Maharaj, and Ulrika Hagman. This also is going to be the last episode of the year. As you may remember, I do 50 episodes a year. I take 2 weeks of hiatus around the holidays just to breathe a little bit. So there will be no episode next week or the week after, but we will return on January 6th. Remember, the show comes out every Monday. That will be the next episode after this one. What do we have on deck for you today? Well, I had the opportunity to chat with author, writer, and biographer Stephanie Gorton. She is the recipient of multiple fellowships and prizes. You may have read her work in different outlets like The New Yorker, Smithsonian, and Paris Review Daily. And her previous book, Citizen Reporters, is now available on paperback. But she has a new book out. It's called The Icon and the Idealist: Margaret Sanger, Mary Ware Dennett, and the Rivalry That Brought Birth Control to America. So without any further ado, here she is, Stephanie Gorton. Well, Stephanie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So I am excited to talk about your new book, The Icon and the Idealist: Margaret Sanger, Mary Ware Dennett, and the Rivalry That Brought Birth Control to America. So there's a lot to dive into. It's probably more relevant. I shouldn't say more relevant now than ever. It's always been relevant. But before we get into the topic of your book, I want to learn a little bit more about you. So you are a writer, you are a biographer. How did you first, get into this field? It seems like writing is one of those things where when we're young, we're like, oh yeah, I want to be a writer. But then it's like, that's a real job. You got to work hard at it.
It's kind of a real job, and it's absolutely hard work. I started out, I worked in book publishing for about a decade, acquiring and editing books, mainly for small indie presses. And I got really curious about, I loved my work, but just about what it would be like to jump across the aisle and take on a creative project of my own. So I did a low residency MFA, specifically in nonfiction writing. And that put me on a path to my first book project, Citizen Reporters, which is set in the world of muckraking journalists in the Gilded Age. And that in turn opened up the kind of possibility that I could take on a bigger topic or one that was really close to my heart. And it also, I think I gained in confidence as a researcher and a biographer and a journalist. And that's what brought me to take on The Icon and the Idealist, this dual biography of Margaret Sanger and Mary Ware Dennett. And it's also kind of traces the cultural changes that brought sex and birth control from the realm of taboo into the mainstream. So I still take on editorial work, and I still very much see myself as an editor, but writing has been, a bigger and bigger part of my life as time has gone on.
So talk to me, you gave a perfect segue into the book, and you mentioned how this project was very personal to you. And obviously, like, you and I are sitting here across the country, across the internet as women, and this is an important personal topic to us because we are women. But are there other reasons why this story specifically spoke to you?
I'm a longtime volunteer with my local abortion fund, and I think just taking part in the nuts and bolts of activism got me curious about what repro rights activism looked like before Roe and before those years immediately pre-Roe. I was intrigued by the fact that birth control is so mainstream, so uncontroversial, so woven into our public health policy today, whereas abortion is this, hot button issue. And I really started to wonder whether that was always the case. I also am really interested in trying to write history in a way that doesn't participate in the one great hero or one great villain theme of telling a story. I think if you can go through a few specific episodes in history from a framework where you're focusing on relationships and on the bigger picture that way, or even on a group or on a campaign, that could be an interesting way to approach it. So I think both my own activism and the fact that I wanted a kind of sideways angle into telling this story, and this relationship between Dennett and Sanger was kind of there in the historical record. It all came together. And I knew once I had landed on their story and started reading their letters, I wasn't going to be able to let it go.
So obviously, as a writer, even a writer of historical nonfiction, you have a point of view. You are sitting down with your own life experience and your own frame when you go to undertake a project like this. But then the work itself, I can only imagine, has this sort of reciprocal feedback. So you are affecting your work clearly because you are the one sitting at the computer. But I'm curious how doing this project, writing this book, affected, I don't know, your point of view and your activism.
It absolutely affected my point of view because I did, like you said, I think everybody, especially in the world of biography, it's as much a portrait of the writer as of the person that they're writing about, right? It's the issues and the priorities and the emotional resonances. Those are what are going to come out in your narrative, and they're going to change author by author. I came to this story really thinking Mary Ware Dennett is an underdog activist that more people need to know about. And I still firmly believe that. But the flip side in my mind, I think unconsciously, I started to think of Sanger as this overbearing eugenicist villain. And she is absolutely a complex figure and participated in the eugenics movement. But the fact that there was this rift between them uh, and that they were both at fault was something I really had to reckon with. So, in a way, I took on the project because I wanted complexity and I was expecting it. But, it took some unlearning and some retraining to get myself to really take it on, at face value, to really start from the material. I think that was a huge lesson in the course of writing this book. Was laying out digitally in my Scrivener document all the transcripts of the letters, the drafts of the letters that didn't get sent, the campaign diaries, putting them in sequence, and then drawing from that what was reasonably possible to extrapolate about their relationship, not coming to it with the fact that, oh, this could be, a very entertaining, juicy narrative about this fraught relationship. I think I had visions of prestige TV in my mind, and I kind of had to wipe it all clean and really zoom in on the material and go from there.
So I think, some people listening may have heard the name Margaret Sanger. They may not have, but they may have. I think fewer people have probably heard the name Mary Ware Dennett. Were you always aware of Mary Ware Dennett?
Not at all. No. It was only when I began looking into the birth control movement that Mary Ware Dennett's name came up. And Sanger is a notorious and very well-known figure. She founded the organization that's today called Planned Parenthood. And of course, more recently, her name has been taken off of the Planned Parenthood building in New York City because of her association with the eugenics movement. But she was really the savvy, charismatic leader of the birth control campaign. in the first few decades of the 20th century. Dennett emerged, I realized she was the first person to ever take reproductive rights to Congress. She went down to Washington and she lobbied Congress to legalize birth control between 1919 and 1924. So this is exactly a century ago. She's doing something completely radical as a middle-aged woman, a single mother, someone who had never intended to have a career in activism. She trained as an artist. It was a combination of traits that was pretty irresistible. There's an excellent biography of Dennett published about 25 years ago. It's called The Sex Side of Life by Constance Chen. But nothing since then. And has nowhere near the present day public profile that Margaret Sanger does. I think there's a couple of reasons for this. I mean, first, Sanger lived much longer. She lived a couple decades longer. She was able to go on TV and frequently appeared on radio. And she was extremely good at being a public figure. She knew how to court outrage and how to manipulate the press. And Dennett, meanwhile, was fiercely private. She died relatively young, and she didn't really like reporters even while she was alive, probably to the detriment of her work. But that all served to make her even more fascinating.
I'm really curious about their kind of the nature of their relationship, because these are two women who had obviously a very similar passion, a very similar cause, who in many ways wanted the same thing, but they were wildly different in their approaches. So maybe you can tell us a little bit, even the title of the book, The Icon and the Idealist. Clearly Sanger was the icon, as you just described. Why the idealist for Dennett?
Right. Well, I should say it's also never that simple, is it? Sanger certainly had her ideals. And Dennett, as I was researching her, what was kind of amazing to discover was how neatly she had filed away her own papers and belongings. Like, she knew a biographer was going to come along later. So there was a sense that she was aware that she could have a place in history herself. They did share this passion and this vocation even to bring birth control to American women in the first couple decades of the 20th century. But they came from such wildly different backgrounds. And I think that also served to feed the divide between them. Sanger came from an impoverished Irish American family. She was the sixth of 11 living children. And on top of those 11 children, her mother had at least 7 miscarriages. So she was pregnant or nursing or miscarrying for the majority of her roughly 30 years of marriage. She also had TB and died when she was barely 50 because the disease was exacerbated by this relentless sequence of pregnancies. So Sanger, I think, saw that happen. And then later worked as a visiting nurse in the tenement neighborhoods of the Lower East Side, and saw again and again women who were trying to induce abortions, who were desperate not to have another child because they couldn't provide for them because their living circumstances were already so dire. And she saw that they really had no recourse. Doctors were unwilling and really unable to share information with them. It just wasn't part of medical training at the time. Whereas Dennett, really comes from a point where her own experience of maternity kind of radicalizes her. She had extremely agonizing, unusually traumatic births with all 3 of her children. She probably had a condition called a fistula, which is where an extra cavity opens up in the genital region and it can't heal without surgery. But after her second son was born, she was so ill. And he also was traumatized. He was unable to feed, and he died of malnutrition when he was 3 weeks old. So after her third child was born, Dennett's doctors told her she could not risk another pregnancy. Having no access to birth control, she and her husband simply stopped having sex. And within a couple of years, he has left the family amid a really scandalous public divorce that was fodder for the Boston tabloids. Dennett actually came to birth control because of Margaret Sanger. She saw Sanger speak at a lecture in New York City and very, very quickly, birth control became the center of her life. So I think for both of them, there's definitely truth in the fact that the personal was political and motivated them to be highly political for the high points of their careers. But they came to it from a very different place, and they began working together. But really, the class differences between them were pretty uncomfortable. And it didn't take much for Sanger to begin to feel slighted by Dennett. At first, potentially not too much grounds in reality, but then Dennett really did stumble. When Sanger was arrested for violating the Comstock Act, which was a mail censorship law, postal censorship law at the time, she came to Dennett for moral and financial support, and Dennett refused to give it. So there was an unforgivable slight there that really stayed between them, that made it impossible for them to reconcile for many, many years afterward.
Was there a reason given at that time that she didn't want to come to her aid?
Dennett had a pretty clear reason. She had just made some headway with an organization she had co-founded called the National Birth Control League. She was focused on repealing the postal censorship laws in New York State. And she didn't want to be associated with someone who was openly breaking the law, as Sanger did when she printed pamphlets and magazines relating to sex and birth control. And she knew she was violating the Comstock Act, the censorship law, but she thought that breaking the law was actually a good way to reinterpret it in court and could be an effective way of changing the law. Dennett felt very differently. I think coming from a place of more privilege, she thought that systems could be made to work for her if she worked well within them, if she followed the rules. So the fact that Sanger openly broke the law made Dennett uncomfortable, and she thought it could make her lose credibility in her lobbying efforts. That's why when Sanger came to her asking for help, Dennett said, we disagree with your methods, and it's not a connection that I can afford to have right now.
It's so interesting thinking about even just like the modern kind of political landscape. And we saw these types of conflicts playing out again and again during Me Too, during BLM. We even see them during this most recent presidential election with the different approaches to Palestine and Gaza, this very kind of fractioning and this infighting of progressive movements where people may agree on the ultimate outcome, the ultimate goal, but they become so fractured because of differences in opinion of how to get there.
Definitely. And looking back, you could just see how much was lost in the birth control movement specifically by having these two factions. Donors didn't know where to send their money, which one would be the most effective group. It gave congressmen a great excuse not to support a bill proposed by either group, because they said, you really have to resolve the conflicts within your movement. We're not sure what you want. It seems like you're just using these separate lobbying efforts as a way to fight with each other. It helped people not take the movement seriously. The fact that they were unable to come to a place, maybe not even of unity, but of working in some complementary fashion, of being able to divide the work and at least be civil with each other and keep lines of communication open.
Which is, of course, so incredibly frustrating because, it's not hard to find reasons for your misogyny when you're operating in this sort of deeply sexist and patriarchal structure, which of course still persists to this day. But we have to remember that this was happening against the background of women's suffrage. Women couldn't even vote except very early in this process. So just even to be heard in the halls of Congress must have been such a fight.
It's so remarkable to read Dennett's campaign diaries, because she talks again and again about what these meetings were like. This is the first time that reproduction has been talked about, in lobbying meetings. So she has again and again, congressmen would turn red, ask her if she was married, if she was a mother. They would simply usher her to the door. Some of them would start yelling at her, got extremely irate. talk about how it was it's a national problem that women weren't having enough children, or really, I should say that the right kinds of women weren't having enough children. There was one congressman who told her that too many women prefer to be idle and have lap dogs, which I think is an interesting rehearsal of the childless cat lady categorization. So she really, again and again, there's not just quiet hostility or mockery, but rage that she's up against. And, I think part of why it was so challenging was she started in 1919. So women are about to get the vote. And at the beginning, Dennett has this bargaining chip. She can say, once women have the vote, they will want to be represented by someone who supports their interests. And birth control is clearly a major priority for women and for women voters. Once women actually begin voting, it turns out they don't vote as a bloc at all. And they don't write to their elected leaders about birth control. So that case falls apart, which is, extremely challenging for her, and something that I think we also see today, right?
Mm-hmm.
Polls,
see
media.
The most recent presidential election.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, this may sound like a kind of a silly question, but, at this time, we were talking 100 years ago, what was birth control? Like, how was it defined, and what was the birth control of the day?
The short answer to that is the diaphragm, but that is a really interesting question because it's not just about technology or about methods, but really about perspective. In the late 19th century, there was a voluntary parenthood campaign, which never got to the stage of a legal or political campaign, but it was essentially a feminist movement for the right of wives to decline marital sex. So this was a time when husbands kind of had eminent domain over their wives' bodies, and the idea that a wife could decline marital sex was pretty radical. But because there was no regular birth control used in most marital bedrooms, the right to say no was also the right to control your fertility. So there's some really interesting essays written about this. And, often the same people who were very pro voluntary parenthood would have been very against condoms, diaphragms, because the idea was not to bring women to the level of being able to have non-procreative sex or sex for fun. It was to make men more moral, to give men more self-control or ask them to have more self-control. So that's phase one, if you like, of yes, I think there's a quote about this is not the leveling down of women, but the leveling up of men. That's the pre-turn of the century movement for fertility control. And then the diaphragm is invented and popularized in the 1880s. And that is kind of this quiet revolution because it can be deployed by women. It's affordable. It can be used again and again. You don't necessarily have to have running water to be able to use it. The other really popular methods would be a postcoital douche, and you did have to have water pretty close by to use that. Condoms were so closely associated with prostitution that they wouldn't have been used by all that many married couples. But the most popular method by far in the period we're talking about, which is the 1910s through the 1930s, is withdrawal. The issue there, of course, is that it cannot be controlled by the woman. So as the diaphragm is coming into more common use, really the campaign to legalize birth control and for doctors to be able to prescribe birth control, that is when they're thinking, what technology are we really talking about? They're talking about the diaphragm.
So the diaphragm at this point was illegal?
It was, yes, because of the Comstock Act of 1873. I'm sure lots of listeners are familiar with this, but that was a postal censorship law that prohibited the circulation by mail of anything to do with sex, birth control, abortion. Its intended claim was to stem the flow of pornography around the country, but its actual effect was it tried to, it really didn't completely suppress, but it really put a chill on the mail order markets for contraceptive devices and abortifacient drugs. and of course, anything relating to sex education.
And so that would have, was that like a consumer law, or you couldn't even, I guess manufacturers wouldn't even be able to ship their products to stores?
Oh, they did. The market always finds a way. So,
Uh-huh.
by like advertising for diaphragms using euphemisms, they could call them uterine supporters or
Mm,
ladies' friends. And there were some doctors also that would prescribe them. So it was possible, mainly for middle class and upper class women, to
mhm.
get a hold of them because they knew where to find the friendly doctors and how to decode the ads and order them to their homes.
Yeah, I mean, which obviously persists to this day, the deep inequity in healthcare, that those who very often need early and thorough intervention are those who don't have access to it. Gosh, we just see that recapitulate over and over again.
Exactly, exactly. And that's also where in this movement, Dennett had this what I really think of is why she's the idealist is she had this vision for equitable access to birth control, that she would simply delete the prohibition on contraception from the Comstock Act, and that would let that mail order business open up once more. It would let not only doctors, but nurses, social workers, really anyone who is trained to do it would be able to fit a diaphragm, order a diaphragm. What ended up happening was a pretty giant compromise that was headed by Margaret Sanger. She thought, to make this happen in our lifetime, we'll need to get men, and specifically men of science, on board with it. And so she drafted a new version of this campaign called the Doctors Only Compromise, where the prohibition would be lifted, but only doctors would have the right to prescribe birth control and to fit diaphragms. So that's, in a way, started off a whole legacy of um, paternalism in medicine when it comes to birth control, of gatekeeping. And but it was effective. It did bring birth control to American women within Dennett and Sanger's lifetime.
What was the relationship? Earlier when we were talking about Margaret Sanger, you mentioned that as a sort of known eugenicist, after so many years, Planned Parenthood sort of removed her name because of that legacy. What was the relationship between her eugenicist ideals, which were quite common, by the way, in the 20s? I remember watching a pretty brilliant documentary on PBS about the eugenicist movement in America and how so much of it actually shaped um, a lot of policies of the Third Reich, and that it was. I don't want to say it was mainstream, but it was a pretty common movement about sort of like health and wellness, and it was all this veiled um, middle upper class bullshit. But eh, at the time, how was that? Um, I don't know, that ideology baked into her activism?
Right. Yeah, it was about the fit and the unfit, right? These
Mhm.
extremely coded words where fit
Mhm.
always meant white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and unfit had this whole host of potential categories. It was people of color, people with disabilities, but it could also be people with epilepsy, TB, alcoholism, people who were illiterate, people who just didn't keep their houses very clean.
Yeah,
It
just
was
people who are
a
poor. Yeah.
yeah, right, right. It was
Yeah.
an extremely malleable concept.
Mhm.
Eugenics was it was in the halls of power. It was really mainstream. It can go back to 1913, where Teddy Roosevelt was urging white native-born women to have at least 4 children because he was worried about the white race being submerged. And this messaging really carries on through the 1920s. So Sanger and Dennett are struggling to get politicians to take birth control seriously. And meanwhile, they're watching eugenics inspired legislation fly through Congress. There are immigration restrictions passed in 21 and 24. And then there's Buck v. Bell, a Supreme Court decision in 1927 that affirmed the right of the state to sterilize its citizens. So they really started courting eugenicists and tying their birth control propaganda to the eugenics movement, thinking that it would make elected leaders warm to the idea of birth control. That, if they thought fertility control could be woven in with this larger, bolstering of the race that was so popular at the time, then that might actually help their campaign succeed. It was always a pretty one-sided thing. So Sanger especially, went really hard, and I think enthusiastically and genuinely supported the ideas behind eugenics, especially when it came to people with disabilities. Interestingly, small footnote that doesn't really excuse anything that came afterward, but she never said anything about race. This was never, to Sanger, a white supremacist campaign. But she certainly never declined a donation from a white supremacist. So she becomes extremely fervent and vocal in her support of eugenics, hoping that it's going to give her campaign political traction. Dennett was never quite as enthusiastic. She was never quite as wholehearted about it. I think after the first few experiences of rejection and distancing from the eugenics establishment, she thought, she kind of understood that feminism was very much not part of their campaign, that giving individual women the right over their fertility was not an appealing concept to them when there were ideas like immigration restriction and sterilization that were doing really well politically.
So there was a real calculation there. Did you, in your research, notice a difference between their sort of public facing rhetoric and their personal discourse?
Sanger gave actual speeches and that were totally focused on eugenics related ideas. I think there was one she gave where she even talked about how there should be tracts of land set aside in the West where the unfit should be sent and segregated by sex and put to useful work. Dennett just never did anything like that. She was extremely focused on birth control. She kind of guarded her campaign and her lobbying work, did a lot of it herself, very little help, put her own money into it till she was deeply in debt. And it was also, Dennett was much more willing to try and build bridges to the Catholic Church, who of course historically have been a huge opponent of birth control and also a huge opponent of eugenics. So, she would send letters saying, "Oh, I understand where you're coming from. This is an age old aversion and that you have to contraception. I know people who feel that way. I used to almost feel that way myself." Just these very amenable letters. So she cast aside the eugenicists pretty early on and instead starts trying to build bridges with the Catholics. Sanger remains a foe and a kind of an outright um, opponent to the Catholics for her whole career.
And what about in their sort of personal letters and discourse? Was Sanger, for example, pretty fervent in her eugenicist ideology, even when talking among friends and talking to other women? Did they sort of let more feminist ideals out when they were no longer sort of politically angling, but they were just talking about, fundamental human rights?
Yeah, there's definitely a tonal difference in their more personal letters. Eugenics doesn't really come up at all, and you'll even see, that's where I was able to glean some great details about their support of abortion rights and how they would help women in their circles find the right doctor, get an abortion, terminate a pregnancy if they needed to. Both Dennett and Sanger did that, but abortion was so out of bounds politically that tying their birth control campaign to abortion rights was never on the agenda. So their personal letters, I think, really did give some insight into just that there was a lot of political calculus behind their pursuit of eugenics and their kind of wooing of prominent eugenicists. That was very much because they thought it would be good for the movement. But many of their letters, when they're talking about more private matters, they don't touch on that at all. I mean, you could probably say the same. I'm trying to think of people like Paul Popenoe or Davenport, or the really, the leaders in the eugenics movement. I'm sure they have volumes of letters where they're saying kind things to their families too. But in this case, I really did get the impression that this was something they thought would be helpful politically, and of course, it's something that is the hardest of all to reckon with. That the reproductive rights movement and eugenics were woven together from so early on.
Yeah, I think it's easy to stand in hindsight of history and to say to ourselves, well, what would I have done? Well, clearly I wouldn't have, aligned with these, this rhetoric, or clearly I would never have, X, Y, and Z. But I don't think any of us knows at the time what we might have done. And I think very often women find themselves, and this is not, obviously specific to women, but any marginalized group, from an intersectional perspective, finds themselves having to make very difficult, calculated decisions about playing the game and trying to affect change from the inside or from a privileged position, which often require some negotiation of morals or values, right? Because if you're outside screaming that you want change, you're not listened to. And then once you enter the halls where change is made, very often you're expected to play by a certain set of rules.
Sanger definitely took that journey early on. She writes a birth control related pamphlet called Family Limitation. And in the earliest editions, she actually writes in some formulas that could help women terminate a pregnancy or very early on. And in later editions, that and any reference to abortion is stripped out. You can also see early on, she kind of has a snobbery towards what she called drawing room lizards, or, women, club women, upper class women who are intent on doing good. And as her career goes on and she realizes, the realities of fundraising and the realities of building a movement and trying to incorporate many different people, her grassroots donations are still important. But more and more, those women she talked about as drawing room lizards, those become her inner circle. And she is giving talks to clubs and, very much becoming the institution, whereas she had always felt she started as an outsider.
I'm curious, I know I'm kind of accelerating just for the sake of time, and if there's probably a million things I left out, and if there's anything that you want to make sure we highlight, please, just go there. But I'm curious how this, in some ways, ended for them. You talked a little bit about ultimately the ultimate outcome, I guess, legally or legislatively, but what about their relationship? How did it ebb and flow?
They never reconcile. Dennett, I think, is, the part I assign her much less fault for this, in large part because she had really nowhere near as many resources as Sanger did. And she had extremely pure intentions. Whereas Sanger, I think, had a real bitterness against Dennett that stemmed from that early feeling of betrayal, of rejection, when Dennett refused to lend her some moral and financial support right before one of her trials. Where this went legally is that in 1936, Sanger orchestrated a case called U.S. versus one package of Japanese pessaries, which has to be one of the best case names ever. But essentially, she had a package of diaphragms shipped to her clinic director, and when it was intercepted and brought to trial, the judge said, "No, doctors do have the right to prescribe birth control at their discretion for any reason." This was expanded in 30 years later, in 1965, Griswold v. Connecticut. That meant all married Americans had access to birth control. And in 72, another decision which expanded that to the unmarried also. Where this went for Dennett is really interesting. After she retreated from Congress, she basically turned to writing Sanger these needling letters about how she needed to let go of the doctor's only compromise and instead pursue just deleting the prohibition on birth control from the Comstock Act, trying to open up contraception, access to contraception for all Americans, regardless of whether they had access to a doctor or a clinic or not. She strongly felt that that was more fair, especially for poor and rural women. But Dennett, this whole time, had been, as a side hustle, selling a sex education pamphlet she'd written when her sons had been teenagers. And then she was arrested for obscenity after sending it out to a vice agent posing as a customer in 1929. She was very quickly found guilty in a very high profile trial. This was kind of the peak of her fame, not her birth control work, which I have to say wasn't even mentioned in her New York Times obituary, but her defiant stance for sex education, that it was not something to be ashamed about, that other resources connected to sex ed were too vague, were too based in shame and abstinence and fear, and that people deserved access to evidence-based information, that, you know, kids should know the facts of life and it shouldn't have any more weirdness attached to it than how the lungs work or how the heart works. So she was acquitted. The decision was reversed on appeal a year later in 1930. And that, you know, gave her enough of fame to get a book deal, to live slightly more comfortably, and that really became what she was best known for the rest of her life.
And you mentioned that she died younger. What ultimately, how long, let's say after that that decision, that appeal, was she able to continue doing her activism work?
She went back to doing artwork.
Oh.
She had learned how to do this old Spanish craft. It's kind of leather work, making what's called a guadamassil, just kind of like a gilded leather work. And it's something she found refuge in through her life. She spent every cent she had and many more besides on her activism, and kind of ruined her health at the same time. So she turned back to art in tough times. She had a lot of caregiving work for her mother, her kids, her grandkids, and she kept up her writing. But for all intents and purposes, she had retreated from having any kind of a public profile in the
Mm,
1930s.
mm. And Sanger, of course, went on. And how long was she active?
Sanger was active through the 60s. Her last decade was more difficult, and she lived in Tucson more privately. But definitely in the 50s, she was still on television, and she was very involved with the formation of the Planned Parenthood Federation. What's kind of interesting is that as the leadership of Planned Parenthood, a name that she really didn't like, she thought it kind of let go of the clarity and the purpose of a name like the Birth Control Federation. Planned Parenthood seemed very conservative, kind of avoidant of what the real issue was. Saying as also as the leadership became more male, Sanger found herself edged out, or seen as more of an inconvenience. She also helped coordinate the funding and the research that gave rise to the birth control pill, and she remained very active. This was really her life's work through at least the late 50s.
Well, and it's interesting you mentioned previously the outcome of this activism, these court cases that, were codified or at least continued into the 60s, into the 70s. We're still battling even today for some of these basic reproductive rights. And so I'm curious, obviously you wrote this book, this historical nonfiction about these two important figures in the movement at a very specific point in time, but that has to be contextualized, right? So how did you go about doing that, talking about what we are facing today in light of the actions of these women, 100 years ago?
To me, this is really essential background, because a major motivator for me diving into the story and writing this book was that it's such a story of a path not taken, that Congress did consider reproductive rights a century ago. And yet, just this past year, the Right to Contraception Act failed to pass the Senate twice. The same for the Right to IVF Act. These aspects of healthcare that have been uncontroversial for years, and yet still, have been a victim of the partisan divide that we have going on now. I really see Dennett's legacy in efforts to pass legislation like the Right to Contraception Act, because getting Congress to affirm that right, which is something that the governments of many other countries that the US considers peer nations, the UK, France, Mexico, Canada, all have the right to birth control affirmed in their constitutions. We don't, because of this kind of fateful detour into legislating via the courts. And I think knowing how that came to be, and just the continuation of the patriarchal slant we keep seeing in our elected leaders, in the dynamics of Congress, in the fact that there just don't seem to be a lot of incentives for affirming a basic right like birth control, even though it is so important. It's been proven. I think World Health Organization says if you don't space births by at least 2 or 3 years, it's absolutely detrimental to everybody's health. There's almost a pattern or a foundation that you can see by reading this story that I think really helps understand what we're up against today.
So how did you do it? I mean, I think that's probably the question to close with that I'm most curious about. How did you write about this against the background of what we're seeing right now? How do you maintain any sort of, I don't know, hope or positive outlook? And I opened sort of with the same question, but how did this work color the way that you see the current landscape?
Right. I started writing this before Dobbs. This was an interesting topic to me, but it was not a flashing red light, siren on emergency in the way that it now is. The threats to abortion rights were not as severe, and the threat to birth control wasn't really something that had crossed my mind. This was an interesting historical parallel, just trying to put myself back in 2019. And then, of course, Dobbs happened. But by then, I was deep enough into the work and had felt this sort of awful responsibility to try and do justice to telling the story of not just one, but two individuals. I think a single biography is already a huge undertaking. A dual biography, the story of a relationship, of a transformative cultural moment. It was such a big project that I kind of allowed myself to be sunk into it a bit. And then, it was also, I had this very fortunate turn of events. I researched and wrote the book during COVID, and there weren't a lot of institutions or archives that I was able to access for a while there. So I ended up making contact with descendants of the people I was writing about, specifically the curator of the Dennett family papers, Sharon Spalding. And the family archives that opened up, and the ability to interview Dennett's granddaughter and look at letters and clothing and diaries. It was so exciting to do that, that it turned the project into a very, very different. It was so much less dry. It was so much more of a detective pursuit. I think that helped a lot. It is really difficult to write about something where you're deeply emotionally involved and invested. But doing it in these bite-sized pieces and finding a kind of collaborative way to go about it, having archivists, librarians who were in your court, that made a huge difference.
So people who pick up the book today, tell me, are they going to be depressed? Are they going to be invigorated? Are they going to be able to find hope?
Yeah, I was talking to someone about this today, and I think the biggest message, which is kind of hopeful, Also, potentially dispiriting is that activism is a really long game. Dennett was in Congress for 5 years and retreated feeling like she'd made no headway. But actually, she had laid all the groundwork, that enabled Sanger to succeed, on different terms in a different way. But less than a decade later, or just over a decade later. So I think that's something to consider. The person I was talking to is an elected leader, and she was also saying people show up the first time they're interested in supporting a bill or advocating for something, thinking it's going to happen in a few months or in a season. But if you care about something, you have to get into advocating for it with the expectation it'll be years. So that I think is both hopeful and maybe a little bit grim.
Yeah, if not a century.
Mhm.
Well, Stephanie, thank you so much for being here. I learned an awful lot. There's obviously so much more to learn. Everybody, the book is called The Icon and the Idealist, Margaret Sanger, Mary Ware Dennett, and the Rivalry That Brought Birth Control to America by Stephanie Gorton. Thanks so much, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Kara.
And to everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.